Well, good morning and welcome to you from a rather soggy Birmingham. I'm Doug Mullen, a senior associate in our employment and pensions team here at Anthony Collins Solicitors, and we're delighted that you have joined us for this webinar on the recent local government pension scheme valuation. At Anthony Collins Solicitors, we aim to improve lives, communities and society, and we therefore work with housing associations, schools and academies, health and social care providers, local government, charities, as well as private individuals. So we're going to try and ensure there's something for everyone as we talk through. The webinar is due to run for about 45 minutes. I plan to talk for about 35 minutes and then answer questions at the end, so leaving about 10 minutes for those. Please do be submitting questions as you go along, and we'll look to answer those at the end. We've also got a couple of polls for you to contribute to, so please do participate as those come along. If you're unsure what to do, then please do just leave it. So anyway, without further ado, we'll move on. Now, for those of you who were hoping to have the pleasure of watching me talk, I'm afraid I wasn't brave enough for that, but there is a picture of me so that you know what I look like. I always find that it's nice to know who you're working with. So if you haven't met me already or haven't Googled me, then there you go. That's the picture. Well, we're aware that people's experience of the most recent valuation has varied significantly, and some people have seen their contribution rate go up, some people have seen it go down, and some people have seen little or no change. So we thought it'd be good to just start with a poll to see what people's experience on this webinar was. So I'll launch that now. So what we're asking is, have your recent valuation results meant that your contribution rate has gone up, gone down, or stayed more or less the same? Please do take account of any deficit contributions when you're answering this question. So we'll give people a bit of a chance to answer, and then hopefully we'll be able to share those results with you. So we've seen some surprising outcomes across the valuation. So we've seen some where people's deficit had gone down, but their contribution rate had actually gone up. And we will look at why that might be a little later. So let's see if we can share the results to that. There we go. So most people have voted, and there are 65% of you who've said that contribution rates have gone up. A lucky 10% have said that contribution rates have gone down, and about 25% of you have said that actually those have stayed the same. Okay, well, moving on then. To the next item. So looking at what we're going to cover today, we are going to look briefly at the background to valuations and the legal basis of valuations, looking at assumptions that are used by the fund actuary and how those affect valuation results, we're going to then have a look at what adjustments could you ask for and how might you do that. We're then going to look at participation in the LGPS in a particular sector, and then round up with just a few other issues which are at least in part related to the valuation, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. So we're just having a few problems getting off the poll, so I'm just going to hide those poll results, and hopefully you'll now be able to see what I can see. So there we go. So valuation as at 31st of March 2016. So the most recent valuation was required to take place as at that date. There are 90-odd LGPS funds across the country, and each one is required to regularly value its investment assets and its liability to pay pension benefits to members. So valuations take place every 3 years. So the next one's due on 31st of March 2019. Well, it's a sufficiently big job that the fund actuaries have up to a year from the valuation date to carry out the valuation. So that's why some of you may only have received your results in early spring of this year, or indeed very shortly before 31st of March. Well, a valuation exercise should result in three things. There should be an overall valuation of the assets and liabilities of the fund, then a report from the fund actuary, and that should set out the demographic assumptions used in the valuation. So that might be things about assuming how long people will live, and therefore how long pensions will be payable for, and then a rates and adjustments certificate for each employer. So that's the important bit for you. That's how much you're going to have to pay as a result of the valuation. And the new contribution rates took effect from the 1st of April of this year. So what's the legal basis of the valuation? Well, the key objective is to secure the solvency of the pension fund. And they've also got to have a look at a number of other things as part of the valuation. So there are a number of things they need to take account of. But the primary thing that they're worried about is, can the fund meet its responsibilities to pay pension benefits? So the first thing they need to have a look at is current and future liabilities. So what benefits have already been earned by member employees? What are they likely to earn by way of benefits in the future? And what's the cost going to be, both now and in the future, of providing those benefits? So that's fairly self-explanatory. They need to look at what's it going to cost. The next thing is to look at trying to maintain a fairly constant common rate of contributions. So it's obviously not helpful if, as an employer, your contribution rate is fluctuating wildly, because it makes it very difficult for you to plan how you're going to run your business, to know how much you're going to need to contribute. So a specific factor is that actually the funds should look to take account of the fact that it's desirable that they maintain a fairly constant common rate of contributions. They also need to look at what they themselves have said in their funding strategy statement. So all funds have to have a funding strategy statement, which, funnily enough, sets out its funding strategy, so how it is going to fund the benefits that employees are earning. And you can normally find a copy of this on the relevant fund's website. It's well worth a look if you are planning to approach the fund to talk about your contribution rate or to try and negotiate that, because that will often set out in quite some detail how they set contribution rates and how they do so for particular classes of employers. There isn't a standard template for funding strategy statements, so some are more detailed, some are less detailed. Inevitably, some are more helpful, some are less helpful. And then the final thing they are required by law to have regard to is that thing around securing solvency and the long-term cost efficiency of the fund. And it feels like there's an increasing focus on this last one, and that's not surprising, given that the fund's main aim has to be to ensure that it's got enough money to pay the pensions of its members. Well, you'll notice that there's no reference in there to ensuring that the contribution rates are actually affordable for employers. Although it isn't specifically mentioned, my experience is that LGPS funds do take account of this. And that's for the simple reason that actually it doesn't help funds to pay members' pensions if the employers who are actually funding those benefits go bust. So they will be sensitive, at least to some extent, to the financial position of the employers. That said, at the same time, they are not going to want to have a situation where employers leave the fund and go bust, because actually that will leave the rest of the employers in the fund picking up the tab for that employer that has gone bust. They will effectively inherit a share of the insolvent employer's liabilities. So they will want to ensure that each employer is paying their share of the liabilities as far as possible. So moving on then to look at contribution rates. So there are two rates. There's the primary rate, which is the cost of future accruals, which means future benefits. So the primary rate looks at what's it going to cost to fund pension benefits that members will earn in the future. And then there's a secondary rate. The secondary rate is basically an adjustment to that primary rate, and it looks at the particular circumstances of the employer. So that might look in particular at what deficit there is outstanding. Is there a deficit outstanding? Therefore, should the primary rate, so the rate on future benefits, be increased to cover past benefits and the deficit on past benefits? If you're fortunate, then it might mean that you're actually in credit with the fund, and your primary rate will be reduced to reflect the fact that you are in credit. And I have seen that in some employers in the most recent valuations. So the primary rate will be a percentage rate of pensionable pay, and then the secondary rate will either be a percentage adjustment, or it may be an additional lump sum if there are deficit contributions to be made. So then let's have a look at what sort of things will the fund actuary take into account when setting contribution rates. What assumptions will they make? Because at one level, no one knows actually what pension benefits will have to be paid out, and therefore what the cost of those benefits will be in the future. And so the fund actuary, when they're setting contribution rates, will need to make a number of assumptions to try and take into account those unknown variables. So the first of these is the discount rate. So the discount rate is the rate of investment return on the assets held by the fund. Well, if you've seen those adverts in the newspapers, you'll know that very often they come with that little caveat, past performance is no guarantee of future performance. And no one knows exactly how investments are going to perform in the future. So the actuary needs to make an assessment, an estimate of how he or she thinks they will perform in the future. So they'll make an assumption about what the rate of return is that will be made by the assets. So that's the first thing. The next thing is salary increases. So obviously salary increases are going to impact on the level of pensions payable, because the level of pension payable in the local government pension scheme is tied to the level of pensionable pay or salary. So some people will have final salary benefits, some people will have career average rebased earnings benefits, some people will have both. So salary rises or promotions will inevitably affect the level of benefits payable. So the actuary will make some assumptions around the rate at which salaries increase, taking account of promotions. So we've seen the first couple of things. Another thing that needs to be taken into account is inflation. So LGPS pensions in payment increase each year to take account of inflation, that increase is obviously going to need to be paid for. Similarly, career average rebased earnings. So your average earnings over your career are adjusted for inflation. Again, that adjustment is going to need to be taken into account as part of the value of the liability to pay for members' benefits. Life expectancy. Well, obviously, the longer someone lives, the longer their pension will need to be paid for. And assumptions are therefore made around how long people will live for. As you may be aware, women tend, on average, to live longer than men, and so the assumptions will reflect this. And your contribution rates may therefore be affected by the proportions of men and women in your workforce. I should say that that isn't an encouragement to start adjusting the proportions of people in your workforce. Obviously, that would be discriminatory and wouldn't be justifiable. And then probabilities of ill health retirement. So if your regular contribution rate takes account of ill health retirements and they are funded through those regular contributions rather than through additional payments, then you need to make assumptions around how many people are going to take ill health retirement and at what level and when. And then again, around life expectancy and dependence benefits, there need to be some assumptions made around how many people who die will have dependents who are entitled to benefits. Again, it isn't possible to accurately record all of that information, so assumptions have to be made. Now, most of those assumptions are made at a macro level, i.e. across the whole fund, rather than at an employer level. And so the ability of individual employers to actually influence those assumptions is pretty limited. In my experience, the one where employers do have some success in influencing is the one around salary increases. And that's perhaps not surprising, as that's the one over which employers have some control. Okay, so a quick run through then what affects valuation results. So past contributions, so what you've paid in the past relative to what the cost of providing benefits is will inevitably affect your contribution rates going forward. Different liability profiles of employers, so looking at your the profile of your workforce, what's their gender, what's their age, so are they coming up to retirement and therefore there's a relatively short tail of contributions, or are they early in their career and you could therefore reasonably expect that there would be a longer period of contributions, looking at their length of service and their salary. You'll also perhaps look at the type of work that the employer does, which might impact on ill health retirements and how long someone lives. And then the covenant strength of the employer. So how likely is it that that employer will be around in 10, 20, 30 years and still be good for the money? Sometimes that covenant strength is assessed individually. So I know that the London Pension Fund Authority do individual assessments of employers. Other administering authorities I know assess by category. So they'll say, well, local authorities, they're pretty likely to be around. We don't foresee them disappearing anytime soon. Academies, well, they've got the benefit of government guarantee, at least for the time being. So again, they're probably reasonably good for the money. Admission bodies, well, they're a bit more risky. That might depend on whether they've got some kind of guarantee from the outsourcing employer, if it's an outsource, or from another LGPS employer. Obviously, the basis on which liabilities are valued is going to make a difference, and not all fund actuaries value liabilities in the same way. Time horizons. So this could be a couple of things. It might be, well, how long is it expected that a particular employer will participate in the fund? So are they only likely to be there for a short period of time because they are an admission body only for a particular time-limited contract? Or maybe they're closed to new joiners, and so inevitably their employees will at some point cease to be active. But time horizons can also look at how long is it reasonable to give an employer to pay off a deficit, sometimes known as the deficit recovery period. Another thing, so we've looked at this already, actual and assumed rises in pensionable pay. What's the difference in those? The difference in inflation assumptions, so what's the difference between the actual and assumed increases to pensions in payment and deferred pensions? How many people have retired on grounds of ill health? What tier of benefits are they entitled to? Are they an active or deferred member? All those things will make a difference. And what have the assumptions been around that? The difference between actual and assumed amounts of pension ceasing on death. So where people have died, how long have they lived for? How does that match up against the assumptions? And therefore, has pension paid out met the assumption? Has it exceeded the assumption? Has it been below the assumption? Early retirement. So if someone retires early, there will typically be an additional cost to that. Has that additional cost been met? Particularly, there will be an additional cost if any reduction has been waived. And then differences in the funding target being met, in the probability of that being met. So what is the likelihood that the fund assets are going to pay for the benefits? So you might have a 50-50 likelihood. or it might be 75%, or even 90%. Any increase in the funding probability will most likely see contribution rates go up. And we've seen some people whose deficits have gone down, but contributions have gone up because the fund actuary has said, actually, we want to target a higher probability that actually there will be enough money in the fund to pay out. So what sort of adjustments could you ask for? Well, you could ask for longer to pay off your deficit. So you could say, well, I'd like to have a longer period of time for targeting a fully funded position. And whether that's agreed is likely to depend on your covenant. You might be able to argue for a lower probability in meeting the funding target. So if your probability is set at 90%, you might well want to say to the fund, well, that 90% probability means not only is it very likely that the benefits will be funded, it's also quite likely that I'll be paying significantly over the odds, because there's a good chance, a good probability, that actually more will have been paid in than is required. And at the moment, there's no ability to get refunds from the LGPS. So there is an issue of fairness there. Are your additional contributions effectively going to pay for someone else's benefits? Maybe you could ask for the opportunity to participate in the fund's stabilisation mechanism. So some funds operate a stabilisation mechanism, and this is basically a way of smoothing increases and decreases in contribution rates. My experience is that typically you will need to show that you've got a strong covenant, so a strong likelihood of being able to pay what's owed, and a strong likelihood that you'll be around to do that over the long term in order to be able to participate. So you'll see, for instance, with some funds, they'll allow local authorities to participate, they'll allow academies to participate, they'll be much more reluctant to allow admission bodies to participate. Phasing in of contribution rate rises or reductions. So phasing this in may help your cash flow. It may also give you a bit of a cushion if you're phasing in reductions. It'll help to just smooth that contribution rate. Another way of smoothing is to pool contributions with similar employers or employers with similar characteristics. So you sometimes see academies pooled together, and so risk is smoothed across that pool. Or sometimes if there's a connection between employers, then those connected employers will be pooled together. So sometimes you'll see where academies outsource, they will have a pool with them and the employers to whom they have outsourced. And that helps to smooth risk so that typically assumptions are made across the pool, and there will be some winners and some losers, but it does help to avoid wild fluctuations. You may be able to ask for a reduction in contribution rates by providing security, so some form of security or guarantee. So that might be offering a charge over property, putting money into an escrow account, or perhaps by getting a guarantee from another employer participating in the LGPS. So those are some of the ways of getting adjustments Now, some of these, it may be difficult to get having just finished the valuation, but they are things to bear in mind for the future. It may also be that there is some scope still for negotiating lower contribution rates even now. Well, we're going to have a look at another poll, or at least we're going to try and do that. And this one is around whether you've tried to get your contribution rate changed and what your success was in doing that. So there are a number of different options. Yes, I got it changed, or yes, I tried, but I couldn't get it changed, or no, I didn't try, or no, I didn't even know you could do this. So we'll just give a few moments for people to vote. And see what the results are. Okay, well, I think most people have voted now, so we'll close that poll and share the results. Okay, so you should be able to see that now, that 35% had to go at changing it, and they got it changed. There's no one who tried but didn't get it changed. Well, that's an interesting statistic, isn't it? 41% of you didn't try to get it changed, and there were 24% who just didn't know that was an option. So there's a good 65% of you who could potentially look to try and get changes either now or in the future. Well, we're going to move on from that and back, hopefully, to our next there we go. Okay, so moving on. So these are some of the things that people are doing to try and manage their liabilities in the LGPS. There are some people who are looking to incentivize people to transfer out of the LGPS. So some people are transferring their benefits out to, say, a defined contribution scheme, perhaps because they want to try and take advantage of new flexibilities and draw down cash out of their pension. And some employers are incentivizing incentivizing members to transfer out with a view to reducing their liabilities. There are quite high transfer values at the moment, so it's quite attractive to members. But I would say that you do need to be careful around doing this. There's a code of practice that needs to be followed from the pensions regulator, and you could land yourself in trouble if you don't follow that code. Okay, so moving on. Other people are closing to new joiners. So this cuts off the accrual of future liabilities for new joiners and helps to reduce liabilities into the future. But it is important to note that very often pension funds will take account of this in their valuation, and they will use some different assumptions around the valuation that applies to you, and that can result in higher contribution rates. Challenging assumptions. Well, we've talked about challenging assumptions already. As I've said, I think there are some opportunities to do that, but maybe relatively limited scope at the moment. Some employers are closing to all staff, so they're saying both to new joiners and to staff who are currently members, we are going to close the local government pension scheme to you, and that crystallises their liability and can result in a very significant deficit payment or exit payment falling due. It's also important to note that this isn't an option for everyone. So it's not an option for local authorities, it's not an option for academies, because your staff are, as a matter of law, entitled to participate. At least in theory, it might be possible to try and get around that by side agreements with the employees, but I've never seen that done. Negotiating funding agreements. This is something that we're increasingly seeing. Employers are going to the pension fund and negotiating an agreement with them around the funding of their liabilities, so they might agree to provide some security in return for a lower contribution rate. And some people are not doing anything. Some people are unsure what they ought to be doing currently. So let's have a look at a particular sector. If we have a look at the housing sector and some data that First Actuarial, a firm of actuaries, provided in 2016, 12% of housing associations that they work with have the LGPS open to all staff. 72% have it closed to new joiners, and 16% have it closed to all staff. So you can see the trend there that certainly in housing associations there are not many who have it open to all staff, and a large number who have closed to new joiners. Again, not many who have closed to all staff, although we are seeing increasing numbers of employers looking to close to all staff. Briefly looking at some other issues as we draw to a close. So lifetime allowance issues. So for people who have built up a pension pot of more than £1 million, any excess will be taxed at 55%. And so increasingly those with long service or who are high earners are looking at opting out of the LGPS and perhaps taking other benefits. So some employers are offering a cash allowance instead. And there may be some benefit to employers in doing that because it means that liabilities are not continuing to build up for those particular individuals. In terms of outsourcing, so if you're a local authority or a school and you're outsourcing, you need to think about pensions risk when you're outsourcing, because it's a significant unquantified risk. And you need to think about who's going to take that risk when you outsource. Is the contractor going to take it, or are you going to hold on to much of that risk? And if you are going to pass that risk along, either in whole or in part, how will you ensure that people have got enough information to price when they're bidding for your work? For those who are bidding for local authority work or work with schools, the time to have that conversation is up front. The time to have that conversation on risk is before you enter into the contract, so that you ensure you know what you're bidding for. A couple of other things to note. We've seen a few situations recently where there's been underpayment of contributions, certainly around overtime. So where people have perhaps not ensured that overtime, which is pensionable, has been taken into account when calculating contributions, and that's resulted in a significant unpaid liability. And then efficiency dismissals. It's worth being aware that if you are making changes to terms and conditions, which could include closing the LGPS to all staff, then if you dismiss and re-engage and staff members are 55 or more, then they may be entitled to take their pension early, straight away. And that could trigger significant additional liabilities for you. Okay, well, we've come to the end. It's taken me perhaps a little longer, but very happy to take any questions. So I can see we've got one question in here around the lifetime allowance. So I'll read that out. What are the ramifications for an employee who has now exceeded the lifetime allowance? So the ramifications are that potentially they are going to get taxed on that excess. Depending on when they exceeded the lifetime allowance, there are some forms of protection available, so fixed protection and individual protection, and it would be worth employees investigating those to see whether actually they can get some protection from that tax charge. The reason for those protections is that the threshold for the lifetime allowance charge has reduced over the years, and the government has introduced a form of protection every time that threshold has reduced. So I think I'd be recommending that people go away and take some individual advice on that particular issue to suit their particular circumstances. So look at protection. Otherwise, I think they need to look at what is the benefit in continuing to accrue further pension benefits and potentially getting taxed on those. Is it better to actually look at opting out and perhaps negotiating a cash allowance with their employer? That will differ for individuals, so there's not a one-size-fits-all solution there. Okay, well that's the only question that we've had through so far. I'm conscious that we are now at 11:15. I said we would run for 45 minutes. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening. If you had to leave partway through, or you joined us partway through, we have been recording this. There will be access to this on our website. So we will look to email everyone to let them know about that, to provide a link for that, so that you can go back and listen to the bits that you missed, or listen again if there's anything that you're wanting to catch up on again. So thanks very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure having you with us. I hope that's been helpful. Please do come back to me if there are any other questions that you think about. You can find my details on our website, anthonycollins.com. Thanks very much. Bye.